Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen.
Hey mate, how are you?
Oh, fantastic. How are you doing?
Not too bad. My cat's decided it's time to say hello, by the way, so you might be stuck with a tail flicking up there every now and then.
I love it.
Okay, here we go. Hello. Yep. Say hi. Say hi to Daniel.
Oh, a little bit of white.
A black cat. Yeah, hang on. It freaked him out a bit, but still. Cats are easily freaked out, I find. Hang on.
A little milk strip down its face, eh?
Yeah. His sister's even better looking. This is the boy. And there were a usual story. 4 in the litter. They were just abandoned near my wife's sister's place. And, they were going to be left that way. And then they decided to take, they said, can you take some? And Nisa said, we'll take 2 because, one is boring for the poor animal on its own, which is true. And so we got the 2, and they're great fun. I must admit, they're real buzz to have around. And they're very different personalities. Yeah. So he's very boy-like. He just he doesn't want to show too much affection, but he'll just hop up every now and then, and he bites to show affection.
Oh, yeah.
This morning, thank Christ, it's the first time he's bitten me without breaking the skin. So because they've got a much tougher skin than we have, of course. And then the other one.
You're a cat lover. I have a.
No, I'm not. I just said it's. I prefer dogs, but they're great. It's just nice to have a connection to life, basically.
Oh,
they're good.
Yeah. As a philosopher, I really, I think I gain my most insights in terms of consciousness in watching other animals.
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point.
Our domestic brethren, right? I mean,
yeah.
You think of a dog that has probably the most socialized domestic animal compared to, it's our best friend in that sense, right? But without language and us being language animals, I mean, how does the consciousness actually differ, right? What it's like to be a bat, a dog, and they don't have language. We notice with our own little dogs that they understand language, they understand certain commands. And I think this idea of an ordered arrangement of knowing what's going to happen next is something that this predictive function that we look out for, which is kind of foundational to like a natural form of logic. It's something that, I would say at a cellular level, we follow those rules, right?
Yeah, well, there's even been research that I've seen recently that slime mold can behave in an intelligent way. So in that sense, consciousness is a much more pervasive thing than we realize. It's self-awareness. I think we mistake self-awareness for consciousness. And the thing I'm actually amazed by these 2 cats, they both recognize their reflections in the mirror.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. Whereas most cats aren't that bright. They see, it's a rival cat, I've got to attack it. It's me. Okay.
It's all the economics in the air.
I should fix that bit up there.
What the problem is.
So
it's all the economics in the air, Steve. I think I've actually gained a couple IQ points from hanging out with you.
Economics is deadly for IQ. I'm actually writing. I've actually. Do you know the guy called Vox Day at all?
Yes. Yeah, we want to get him on here. He's
if I can get Vox on very easily. We were chatting yesterday.
Yeah.
He's become a good friend, and he's just actually volunteered to be my publisher. He's got an unbelievably good publishing deal. You get 50% of the face value of the book. Not that particularly motivates me, but it shows what he's like. And I have a great deal of respect for him. So you want to come on the podcast? For sure. Because actually, would you like to come on the podcast? He'll say sure.
Yeah, because behind us we've got a publishing company, and we always look. It's a natural fit. It'd be a fun conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can arrange that for sure. He'd enjoy that.
Yeah. I find the conservative standpoint is always very easy and fast to shore up, right? And I can appreciate that side. I think I grew up in a conservative mindset. Alberta, right? Little mini Texas oil state of Canada, and I was a young conservative.
I had a conservative upbringing as well. My mother and father were both conservative. My father especially so. I came to being progressive by reacting to the economic and political circumstances of my time. And then, what I respect is integrity. And if you can and you get people who are willing to listen to alternative view, and Vox has got that in spades. Yeah. So he's like you said, he's actually said if he knows we're politically at other sides of the spectrum, but if I believe something, he takes it seriously, even if it contradicts his own priors, which is kudos to him basically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think you can, if there's people willing to have a synthesis, a discussion, and you're willing to, maybe that's the idea, that we need more open dialogue on problem resolution, right? As opposed
not ideological reactions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it seems so simple, but we have such an inertia with the system in place.
I think it's also the nature of human nature itself, and human nature is necessarily social. If you try to talk about humans in isolation, that's bullshit. But that's where neoclassical economics starts from. So no wonder it ends up in Crapsville. But if you look at humanity, we've always been a collective species. There's no such thing as an isolated human. The Robinson Crusoe thing is a total myth. And the first thing Robinson Crusoe desperately wanted was another human. So it's just ridiculous to start from the point of view of an isolated human being, which they do. But if you look at us as social creatures, we've always defined ourselves in relation to how our community responds to us. And the general of everything is that makes you conformist, which is part of the problem. The exceptions there are sometimes the ones that are, the other side is you can go against your community, and that's the contrarian. But the majority are always conformist. And that's partly why we succeed as a species, but it's also our downfall.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it. I think this descriptor of eusociality is really what makes us human, and there's a lack of it in our society. This proximal and distal relationship between the individual and then the group. But I have a question for you about that. You have when you had two let's say an economics textbook that was focusing on the neoclassical, and you say it focuses more on the individual. Okay. Yeah. Right. So you have an equivalent like post-Keynesian textbook, and it says, well, we look more at it from a group standpoint, right? From first principle. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So beyond that being a preface to a book and a nice description, I mean, what is it about the mathematics that starts to emerge right away that is a plurality versus monad?
Oh, one of the easiest things is that if you start from the point of view of individual, you have no concept of income distribution. Okay, so if your core model is a utility maximizing individual, you take the income that the individual gets as exogenous. Okay, it's predetermined. So when you look at the way that neoclassicals model consumer preference, they start with the idea of a consumer choice. They start with the idea of a consumer with a given income that's not varied in the analysis, and given preferences. Okay, so you got apples and oranges, and you've got a utility surface that shows how much utility you get from various combinations of apples and oranges, and the amount you can buy is given by a straight line connecting the point where if you spend all your money on apples versus all the money on oranges, that straight line is given, and then they'll vary the price without varying the income to see what your demand curve is, and bang, they've got a downward sloping demand curve once they do what they call Hicksian compensation. And that's all, taught in great glee. This is sort of one of these revelationary elements of an inculcation in neoclassical economics. And then they say, and therefore the market curve slopes downwards. Now, when you look at people who try to do the mathematics properly, and the key ones are a guy called Gorman back in of all things, 1953. Okay, year I was born, bloody ridiculous length of time ago, and Samuelson in 56, and then a group of mathematical economists around the late 60s, early 70s, Sonnenschein, Mantel, de Breu, and Schaefer. They attempted to see what could you actually derive a downward sloping market demand curve by aggregating the demands of all the individuals in an economy. Because if you're going to have a market demand curve, by definition, it's reference to a particular economy. And if it's the market demand curve, then it has to reflect the incomes of all the people in that community. So when you do the individual analysis, you can vary the price and assume the income is unaffected. But when I'll try to do it for the aggregate, when you vary the price, you will vary the distribution of income, because if you make apples more expensive, then whether the income of apple producers goes up or down depends upon the reaction to that higher price of everybody in that economy, including those who produce apples and those who produce oranges. And mathematically, I mean, the results to me is obvious. But most neoclassicals don't even know about the result and poo-poo it when they get told the results. The result is you can't derive a downward sloping demand curve at the market level. Now, that's an essential part of neoclassical economics, and they can't fucking prove it. Okay, and this is what really pisses me off about them when I see people, saying, "Oh, market demand curve slopes downwards." You can't even prove that with your own theory, So that's their problem. They by leaving income distribution out of their fundamental definition of a human, they have an individual without situating the individual in society. Then you get this individual-focused analysis, which has a logical conundrum right at its very foundation. Whereas the post-Keynesian approach pretty much carries on what the classical school used to do and divides people into social classes. You have at least workers and capitalists. In my work, you have workers, capitalists, and bankers. And therefore, you have a distribution of income between those social classes. And so that's a structural reason why those two approaches to modelling diverge from the very outset. And the post-Keynesian one is more valid. Fundamentally and ironically, the neoclassicals have proven the post-Keynesians and the classical school is right, and neoclassicals are wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, let's say that the balance of power shifts to a post-Keynesian zeitgeist, right? A culture of economics. Then there's still within the field plenty of opportunity to find where that fine balance of economics lie, right? There's still a lot of work to be done.
There's a huge amount of work. This is one of the. I'm writing. My book, the new book, New Economics and Manifesto, should be out, if not this month, then next month in the UK, and I think it's in December. It's going to be out in America, and I mean, a large part of that is teaching post-Keynesians, because there's no way neoclassicals are going to read it. Teaching post-Keynesian some of the mathematics they should have learnt to do their modelling, because one of the great tragedies is that the technical skills that most post-Keynesians have were taught to them by neoclassicals. Just because when you go to university, 85, 90% of the staff and 100% of the tuition is based on neoclassical theory. So you learn econometrics, you'll learn how to build difference equation models of the economy, blah, blah, blah. You won't even learn stability analysis, because equilibrium must be stable, eh?
Equilibrium.
And therefore post-Keynesians, most of them work with equilibrium-based models without realizing that there's a serious question as to whether an equilibrium of the model is stable or not. And so consequently, there's a huge amount of work that's necessary to base post-Keynesian work on the mathematical foundations that it should have, because in a weird sort of way, they're still based on neoclassical concepts.
Well, and then from like an Occam's razor standpoint, it just should be self-evident to the community that the post-Keynesian stance is the way to go.
But anything but. I mean, we're going to be the minority until capitalism collapses. Frankly, that's my considered opinion now. Is that post-Keynesians who've got a more realistic foundation for analysing the economy, and evolutionary economists and complexity theorists and so on. There's a handful of those, of whom I'm one. We won't become the dominant group in economics until capitalism has been destroyed by neoclassical economists.
Yeah, okay. So let me see if I got this terminology right, because I've never used the word before, but you use it quite a bit. Exogenous. So if I say that the collapse was exogenous, then it's like saying the collapse was inevitable.
No, it's like saying it's something outside the system you're looking at caused the collapse.
Oh,
so
yeah.
So if you have a model of the planet and of life on the planet, and life on the planet gets eliminated by a meteor, that's exogenous. Okay. Right. If life on the planet gets eliminated by a volcano eruption, that's endogenous. Yeah. Or a virus.
Yeah,
or a mosquito. So whenever I move like that in my face, it's because a mosquito just went past. So if I suddenly go and do a clap, it's not me giving a soundboard. The fuckers eat my shoes. I mean, it's not as bad as it would have been here 30, 40 years ago, but you still got a lot of mosquitoes in Thailand, and I'm sick and tired of being food. So this sort of stuff,
So here's the real scientific experiment here, okay, Steve? So with no predetermined outcome or teleology in mind, there's no goal or algorithm to this. We're doing this like scientists. We're going to set up a recording device, and every time that you clap, we're going to measure it on a graph, right? And then it's going to, it's going to play sounds, okay? Now, if it comes back as a recorded some sort of like, jingle or something like that, what are we going to do about that? What would the scientists say? Like, I have no idea.
I think it's too complicated, mate. I think I'll leave that one out.
Oh shit. Well, anyways, so I've got my my kangaroo shirt on. I mean, I know you're in Thailand, but I've got it's.
Right. Okay. I actually know that. Have you been in Sydney?
Yeah, that was well. My wife brought it back, and I don't think I'll be there. I really don't. I'm really becoming very anti-traveling as of late.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's I've got an ambivalent feeling now. I mean, traveling, which means hopping in a jet and blasting the atmosphere of carbon dioxide coming out the rear end of an engine at 900 kilometers an hour or 800 kilometers an hour. Those days are numbered. So I agree with you completely on that front. I'll be doing a bit of it because I've got to head back to Australia in December to re-enroll as an elector so that I can become a Senate candidate. So I've got to do that. And another part of me, I mean, there's this whole thing about how do you solve climate change, and a lot of people have it's your personal decisions that cause bullshit. Okay, yeah. Yes, in some sense, you can catch the train rather than drive the car in a domestic, in a national scenario. If you got an international situation, what do? Hop on a yacht and go back to Australia? I'll be hopping on the yacht in a couple of weeks to get there by Christmas. So it just isn't feasible. So the structure of society determines those outcomes, not what your individual preferences are. And part of me just thinks, my basic attitude, we're not going to avoid catastrophic climate change. It's going to happen. In some ways, the sooner it happens and we wake up people that don't believe it's happening, the better. So if I decide individually to not to fly, I'm slowing down how soon the gigantic slap in the face comes to the rest of the power brokers in the system who can actually make those decisions about changing investment directions, or they get the slap in the face, kicking the balls, whatever it ends up being. So I'm not going to slow down how soon that happens.
Well, I have the utmost respect for you, Steve, and I think you're one of, a very, very important thinker. I mean, I always kind of pat you on the back from a distance and say, I mean, like what you've released, what you've, submitted to the Royal Society, and the work that you've done to hopefully, counteract the, the Nordhaus claims. I think this is truly remarkable, and on top of that, you're moving for a senator position in Australia, and I think you can be a really, really influential person. So I'm glad that there's a smart person, about to, captain this ship.
Okay, I don't know about captaining, mate. my thought about this is that it really is the case. We've got a bunch of people sitting in the lower decks of the Titanic who've worked out the boat's going far too fast to evade an iceberg. And we're desperately trying to say to the captain, slow the damn thing down, get out of here, turn south. And they're not doing it. And then once they hit the iceberg and it starts to sink, they'll say, here's the wheel. Why don't you take over and see if you can save us? Well, screw you. But that's, I think, only in those circumstances are we going to get any influence.
Well, you say screw you, but it's almost like, I almost see that as inevitable, right? I mean,
it is inevitable. Yeah. I mean,
then the conservative position instantly changes. And now they're still the ones that are right. They just said, hey, we had just to wait for the world to catch up and have sufficient evidence to move in this direction.
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, if you've seen the Murdoch Press Murdoch has given a directive that they have to now say climate change is happening. Have you seen that?
No.
It's quite remarkable. I should have, well, I'll see if I can find a tweet that shows it. But what you have is the Murdoch Press has literally decided that they've got to say climate change is happening now. It's bizarre, but oh, here we go. Perfect. I found it straight away. Okay. I'll do a share screen here because you've got to see this to believe it. Just hang on a second. Do I got share screen here?
Yeah, right at the bottom there.
Hang on. Okay, down here. Go. Boom. Present now, a window. Okay, this will do. So this is the window. Okay, and then, hang on. No, not that one, this one. Here we go. Okay, can you see that? Or is it a bit too...
No, it'll be up there in a second. Okay, there we go. Yeah. The Daily Telegraph. Okay, what am I looking at here?
Well, you're looking at the Daily Telegraph. I'm just going to move this. Oh, pardon me. I just stuffed it up completely. Hang on. Pardon me. Let's go back again. Here we go. Boom. And I've got a dodgy mouse here. Okay, can you see those now?
Well, I can see them, yeah, the Daily Telegraph.
Okay, well, that's from 2019, saying there'll be never enough figures to satisfy the climate skeptics, and here's how much carbon policy will cost the economy. And over here, green and gold, Australia can be number one in the new global economy. And this is just, it is so transparently propaganda. It just takes my breath away. So, rather than being a newspaper, it's a views paper, and it's the views of Rupert Murdoch. And for some reason, God knows why, he suddenly flipped from denying it's happening, which is back in 2019, to, it's happening and we can make money out of it. And it's just crazy. But that's, So what's going to happen is that there'll be no way they hand over power. I mean, I'm actually looking for my other mouse, which works better. I think my cat must. Oh, yeah, that's right. My cat knocked my mouse onto the floor. Isn't that appropriate? Hang on. bring it back, well, and I can. Yeah.
You warned. You warned me earlier. You said, you know what, that cat's gonna cause some havoc.
It did.
Show. Yeah.
It did. Okay, hang on. So what happened? We back on the show again? I can't actually see. Okay.
You're with us. Yeah.
Okay. Am I still presenting that screen, or?
No, it came off, but I think we got that idea.
We got the point. So that's, there's, even if it turns out that the people saying climate change is real and incredibly dangerous, we've been trivialized and mocked and marginalized for the last 50 years. When it becomes obvious we're right, the climate change denying people won't change their position. They still want to be in power. So they're not going to concede to people like me. I'm still going to be in the protest group. And it's going to be irritating beyond belief if those bastards hang on to power, having led us into a catastrophe which is going to destroy the system on which their power is based.
Steve, I'm going to cut right to the chase. I've had the idea. No, I've had the idea from a long time ago. You have to make it about incentive. I'm a pretty smart guy when it comes to philosophy and thinking about these kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm imagining, like the heads of state, the presidents, the prime ministers, the prime minister-elects from the side that we'll just call them left, okay? The liberal tradition. It's like, you need to stay at home. You are going to get a retirement package. Under the MMT sort of thing. This is what you get. There is no. Your life will be better under this.
Hey, I'm not going to bullshit. I mean, for most people in the West, to really cope with this thing, we've got such a drastic decline in consumption that life is not going to be better. Okay, yeah. It'll be qualitatively different and dramatically less consumption. And it could be, it's feasible. If the faster we do it, the more likely it is to be a reasonable life. But in the the thing I'm thinking about is a transition. And I have worked out a incentive type scheme, and that's the idea of a universal carbon credit.
Yeah.
So that's why one thing I'd be doing if I actually have any success in politics in Australia is pushing for the central bank over here called the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, to establish a digital currency, not necessarily for the distribution of money, but there as a structure which could actually distribute universal carbon credits at some point. And then the idea would be that once people will accept, holy shit, we have to really reduce our consumption, but we can't impose the burden on the poor because they're already screwed by the income distribution in the system itself. We instead have everything has two prices, a carbon price and a money price. You've got to pay both when you buy anything. We could start the universal carbon credits at the average for a country, and that would therefore mean that because the income distribution is so skewed, 90 to 95% would not use their entire credit, whereas the top 5 or 10%, and probably 5, would exhaust their credits very rapidly and have to buy carbon credits off the poor to be able to consume. And that therefore puts the burden of adjustment on the rich rather than the poor, and it redistributes income away from the rich to the poor. And it's unavoidable if you set it up that way, that everything has two prices, a carbon price and a money price, then there's no way the rich can evade it, okay? If they want to buy something, they've got to pay the carbon price no matter what. So that would be my way of setting up something which has got a strong incentive to 90 to 95% of the population to actually come out ahead out of that transfer. Now, what happens over time once we realise just how serious this crisis is, then we may be forced to reduce that average, but it would start off at a level where people would actually, at least 90% of the population would benefit, and the poorer you were, the more you would benefit.
Yeah. Steve, there seems to be an implicit bias in economics, and I think this is a humanitarian one where I think foundationally it's maybe equivalent to the doctors I do no harm. We want to, as when we're thinking about economics, we want to avoid revolutions and catastrophic events, right? I mean, isn't this kind of the creed of the Economist that you want to stay away
anything from? Anything but.
Really? Okay.
Totally. They totally ignore that. I mean, if they were thinking about it, then they would have been worried about climate change.
Right.
So their whole thing is just grow as fast as possible. Don't worry about distribution of income. Don't worry about sustainability. It's not a problem. We can find substitutes for everything. I mean, I'm having a Twitter exchange with it looks like a fairly nice person who's a neoclassical economist, a professor, and he's actually a professor in sustainability. I was actually quite amazed to see. He's saying, all you need to do is modify prices. We weren't pricing these things high enough, and the price system can solve everything. And I just replied, how naive. And he got offended by that. Fair enough. But I said, this is why it's naive, and I haven't heard back from him yet. But they basically, they completely ignore the question of whether a crisis can result from this. And like, Nordhaus has projections of the economy growing out to 2,500 while still continuing to grow at the current rate. Now, there's absolutely no concept that, that there's, even on the, forget about global warming, even in terms of the laws of thermodynamics and the generation of waste heat and the increasing radiation of energy from the planet because of waste heat from our economy. There's a wonderful paper, I think I mentioned it to you before, called Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist.
Yes, you told Scott to read it, but now I think you're telling me to read it. So
I'm telling you to read it, yeah.
Okay.
So it's a conversation between a physicist and an economist at a dinner, and the physicist had, as it happens, had worked out how long it would take for economic growth to mean that the radiation of heat from the planet, simply obeying the laws of thermodynamics, okay, nothing to do with global warming at all, would be such that the temperature of Earth would hit 100 degrees Celsius. And the answer was, I think, in 2,500 years. And he said, like, we know what we were doing 2.5, maybe even less than that. It was sort of, we know 2,500 years now, we know that the Greeks were the dominant empire in Europe. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have historical records going back 2,500 years. You said, this is just the same distance in the future as we are from the Greeks. And he said, at that point, like literally, the temperature of the planet would be hot enough to boil water on average. Okay? Now, in 2,500 years. Now, that probably means in about 2,300 years, because that's an exponential process, the temperature would be hot enough to mean that no mammal could survive. And that's without global warming. So if you're a physicist, forget about global warming. In terms of energy consumption alone, there's a limit to how much energy we can consume on this planet. And yet economists blithely, happily predict out stuff going on indefinitely, and none of them have got any idea of this. They're ignorant. They're fucking ignorant. And I'm just, pardon my French, but I'm just getting so sick and tired of dealing with them.
You provide a very sophisticated way to look at the environment and put it into an economic framework. I do applaud you on that. I didn't even know that this type of thinking had existed. Prior to speaking with you, I think the only thing I heard is something like a total 360 accounting, right? In terms of products, like, how like from cradle to grave sort of thing, right? These kinds of programs.
Circular economy stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I heard about it, but this seems to be an economics that describes our interaction with nature at a fundamental level, and that I think is really, really important.
Yeah, it's vital. I mean, that's one reason I didn't get involved in the environmental economics debate until after I'd written that paper back in 2019 with the title of A Note on the Role of Energy in Production. And what it was just a very simple, logical piece, but you can't bring energy into your model of production unless you also bring in waste. Okay? And the neoclassicals had done sort of hand-waving exercises to bring energy in, where they simply had my wife is grabbing my water here, so I'll just, honey, I'll give you that one. Thanks. They took their preferred model of production called the Cobb Douglas production function, and that says output is a function of capital and labor, and they have no role for energy. And when they got challenged by the limits to growth back in the early 1970s, two in particular, Stiglitz and Solow, developed models where they added resources in as a third factor. What they did was they simply multiplied them together. So they had a function saying output is a function of labor times capital raised to both mathematical powers, so that if you what's called constant returns to scale, which is it's one of the few assumptions I can support in classical economics, and that says that if you double all inputs, you'll double output. So the coefficients that they raise the labour and capital to, the powers they raised them to, was such that doubling labour and capital doubled output. So that's just an assumption there. So the sum of the exponents has to be 1. Okay. So they had labour and capital, 2 exponents summing to 1, and they had added resources in there. They called it R for resources rather than E for energy, and they all added that. And the way they calculate the exponents is simply looking at the share of income that those factors of production, as they call them, get in the economy. So when they did labour and capital, they said 70% goes to labour, 30% goes to capital. When they brought in energy, the energy sector is about 3% of GDP, 3 to 5%. So they gave this exponent of energy of 0.03. And I found a recent paper, like 2016, I think, where the neoclassical economists modelling climate change used exactly that form and had energy with a coefficient of 0.03. Now, what that meant was, like, labour is by far, with that mathematics, labour is by far the major factor that causes changes in output with a coefficient of say 0.67 in that case. They had 0.67 for labour, 0.3 for capital, and 0.03 for energy. And therefore, if you said, well, what happens to the output of the economy if your energy levels drop by 85%? The reason I use 85% as an example is that if we thanks, honey, if we find that there's a drastic collapse in energy availability, and if we find, holy shit, this is real, we've got to stop burning carbon in the atmosphere now, shut down any energy source which is not carbon neutral, what does that leave us with? 15% of current production, because if you add up solar, nuclear, and hydro and wind, you get about 15% of global energy output is non-carbon based. So we'd have to have an 85% fall in energy input. Now you feed this into the modified Cobb Douglas production function with energy having a coefficient of 0.03. What does that imply is going to happen to your production? It's going to fall by 5%. So an 85% fall in energy will cause a 5% fall in GDP. Now, if you don't realise that's bullshit, then we should stop the conversation. Of course you do.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the funny thing is, people often wonder, why do I focus so much on the mathematical approach here? It's very simple. That if you look at, and this is a nice illustration of it, if you take my approach, which is what I finally worked out in 2016, it got published in 2019, that the lovely little saying, it gave me the solution. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. So what you've got to treat energy is not an equivalent factor to labour and capital, but an input to labour and capital without which they can do without which they can't do any work. So your function is not L times K times E. It's L with E as an input times K with E as an input. And the energy input you can treat as fundamentally how many units there are, so how many machines, how many workers, times the amount of energy they consume, energy consumed by workers, then you consume by machines, times how efficiently that is turned into useful work. Now, the labour part of that is pretty much a constant when you multiply the two together, because you and I consume an enormous amount of energy. Look at the amount of energy we consume on a daily basis. You measured in tens of thousands of watts. Okay. But the amount of energy we can put into work is about 100 watts. Okay. So we and Buckminster Fuller talked about us having energy slaves that do most of the work for us these days. You go back to Rome, but if you go back, you look at actually, if you are a worker, like an unskilled worker, how much of that energy are you putting into production? It's trivial. Okay. And for a Roman slave, it'd be much more. But when you multiply the two together, the amount of energy consumed times how much is put into useful work, you're going to get 100 watts. So it's a constant. Okay. You look at the machine. The amount of energy being put into a machine was way back when we had the first industrial revolution with the steam engine. The amount of energy that a James Watt's steam engine would consume on a daily basis was about, going from memory, I think about 9 tonne of coal. Okay? Now, when you look at that's the representative machine in that sense that's the machine that defines the early industrial revolution. So 9 tons per coal per day. If you look at the Falcon 9 rocket, that consumes, I think, about 9 tons of rocket fuel per second.
Per second, yeah. Wow.
Okay, so it's 23,000 times as much energy per day, and so that's really where the growth in wealth has come from, this consumption of energy and conversion into useful work by the machine. But when you feed this in, when you put this into the neoclassical's preferred model, what you get is that energy has the same coefficient that capital has. Now, the reason for choosing the share of income is bullshit. They shouldn't be using that at all. It's the wrong number. But even if you do that, that's a 0.3 versus the 0.03 coefficient they get by. Okay, so what that means is when you feed in that 85% fall in energy, what you get out of the correctly modified Cobb Douglas production function, even if you don't take into account the coefficient itself is too small for capital, what you get is an 85% fall will cause not a 5% fall in GDP, but a 44% fall in GDP.
Mm.
So that's very long. I've even forgotten what the question was, but that's why this stuff is trivialized. And they're not even aware of how they're trivializing it, and they're trivializing it by bad mathematics.
How certain are you on the 0.3 discount?
It's bullshit. It's bullshit. I know it's wrong, because again, like this is actually going to what's called the Cobb Douglas production function, and this disease has taken over mainstream economics. And when you look back and see where did it come from, in the attempts to build a mathematical model of the economy, you had to have some idea of a relationship between inputs and outputs. And back in the 1930s, I think, probably with the 1930s, a lot of bad neoclassical economics came out of the 1930s. Cobb was an economist, and Douglas was a mathematician at the same university. I think that's correct. Might be the other way around. But Cobb was looking at labour and capital data series and their annual data series, and looking at GDP as well, and saw some sort of relationship between them. So basically the labour share of output and the capital share of output and output itself. And he then approached the mathematician and said, how can we put these together into an equation? He said, output is labour raised to its income share multiplied by capital raised to its income share. Because you're talking just in two social classes terms, the total is 1. So you have and labour gets about 70% and capital gets about 30%. Then those are the coefficients. Now, and then when you fit it to the data, you get a really high empirical fit. When they first did it, they had a constant times those two. So they had 1 quarter without a GDP, which is measured in dollars effectively, was equal to 1 quarter times machinery, also measured in dollars, raised to 0.3, multiplied by labour, measured in worker hours, raised to 0.7. So it's a crazy calculation in terms of dimensionality, but that's what they did. And they fitted the data really well, and that's one major reason to this day neoclassical economists think it's a pretty hot model of production. The irony is, and this is actually due to another guy we should have on one of these days called Anwar Shaikh. Anwar Shaikh is mathematically easily as good as me, and a non-orthodox guy, more from a Marxian tradition than me. He realized one day that this is just a tautology, that you can actually take the statement income is equal to wages plus profits, and you can deconstruct that using translating it into percentages, and then using the percentages to translate into logs, and then taking exponentials of the logs. That procedure, so long as you have relatively constant income shares between labour and capital, that is the Cobb Douglas production function. In other words, that function, which they think, it's really great that it fits the data, is actually just a transformation of the data. So the coefficients are crazy. Interestingly, this is long-winded, pardon me, going on for a long time here. But one of the few times I've seen a paper by a neoclassical that I actually liked was Gregory Mankiw, who writes the main neoclassical textbook for first years. He he had a paper called the Growth of the Wealth of Nations or something like that, with a Brookings paper back in 1995. And he said, it fits the national data really well to use those coefficients. But when you compare nations, you find it gives crazy predictions. So one of the crazy predictions is the rate of profit in a poor country should be 10 times the rate of profit in a rich country, which it's not. Okay, and there's several other totally obvious empirical errors by using the standard coefficients. He said, but if you swap if you use twice the coefficient for capital that you use for labour, so rather than being 0.7 to labour and 0.3 to capital, you effectively flip it. You make 0.7 capital, 0.3 labour. Your international comparisons make sense.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and it's a very nice paper.
What do you think? What's underlying that? What's any speculation about what that is? Is it why they flip like that? That's
it's because the model's unrealistic. Okay. But you can make it fit the data a bit better with a higher coefficient for capital, but a much higher coefficient for capital. Now, and the reason is, and this is my interpretation of it, by far and away the major thing that produces output these days is machinery. Okay, and labour is just there to manage the machines. So your proper mathematical relationship between output, capital, and labour is output is capital multiplied by by the energy that machines take in times how effectively that energy is converted into useful work. And when I do the mathematics, that's called the Leontief production function, and that's just a straight line relationship. It says output is the efficiency of conversion of energy into useful work times how many machines there are, and that fits the data perfectly. Almost perfectly. So the higher in the Cobb Douglas production function, the higher you make the coefficient for capital, the closer you get to this realistic relationship. But it's not one of the neoclassicals like, that has no substitutability. They've got this hang up on how you can substitute things for one of each other.
It seems so shaky. Like, can't we have another foundation?
We should, yeah.
It seems so arbitrary if it's it seems like, we're just participating in a fictional story let's distance from that.
That's the trouble. I mean, and that is what we have as neoclassical economics, and they think it's all well-grounded, but the further you dig, the more shit you find it's built on top of. And this is the trouble. They use this stuff because it's convenient. And once it's become part of the literature, they regurgitate and repeat it all the time without being aware of the ludicrous foundations on what this stuff is built. And they build this crystal palace on foundations of quicksand.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about a couple people today to get on the show, and I wanted to. I don't know if you saw the email that I sent you, but Jürgen Randers. We want to.
Okay.
And also Stephanie Kelton, if we can,
Yep, I'll drop them both. And just to hit me a reminder, I've seen it, saw it. I just haven't had a chance to reply because I'm caught up getting ready for my new book to come out. But I'll happily drop them an invite and see if they can come on.
So what stage? So the new book, what stage is it at with the printers?
It's I think it's about 2 weeks from being on the shelves. I think October 15, I think, was the date I saw for the UK, and November 15 for America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we wanted to, Scott and I wanted to work on on building a course for you. So we've been diligently taking notes, and I think the idea is that Steve's a very busy guy, and you're having a hard time getting everything done. So I thought, if we could outline something. Like a course, then I think that would be really good. And
Vox actually made this chat we had yesterday. Vox made a good suggestion. He's got a new channel he's putting together, a new social media system, and I'll be putting part of it's like Patreon, and I'll be putting myself up there. But part of what he has is live streams. So what I could do is like a course, but also live stream. So the course would be like the lectures, and the live stream would be like tutorial.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to get involved and talk with him. He sounds like a pretty interesting cat.
Yeah, he is. He is. I know, we haven't actually met yet. I mean, we had plenty of correspondence. We chatted on the phone quite a bit. So I look forward to meeting up with him.
Yeah, you think when there's a bit of a restriction lift, I guess, from the COVID business, is that the main thing?
Oh yeah, well, he's in Europe, so I've got to get back to Europe again, and at some point, I mean, I'll go there for conferences. I've got to go there to fix up my house in Amsterdam, which we rushed out of there in 6 days flat when I got back from Australia back in March of 2020. So I've got to get over there and fix it up to maybe even sell it. So I've got to get over there at some point. So yeah, when that happens, I'll catch up with him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have our little hit list, and we've got about 9 minutes left. So, what should we fill that space with?
Oh well, actually, just an appeal to any Australian viewers. There's now a survey, a petition, which you can find on Twitter and also Facebook, I think, to get the Australian Broadcasting Commission to report on the party that I'm now running for, the New Liberals, because we've got I think we've got some mainstream coverage, like in the Guardian Australia, I think, mentioned that we existed, but apart from that, nothing. So there's just anything to try to raise our visibility would be great. So that's a bit of a plug. Actually, interesting thing. I saw a tweet today. Twitter's not. If the internet's an unreliable source of information, Twitter's that on steroids with attitude. But nonetheless, somebody there tweeted that Morrison's advisors, like his current Australian Prime Minister, have told him to hang on for as long as bloody possible before the election because he's going to get creamed on the current numbers, which is great for us because it gives us until May 23rd to continue raising our profile. So I'm hoping that that tweet is an accurate report of what's happening in Morrison's advisors, and that'll mean there's some reasonable chance of me becoming a senator, which would be
wow.
That's going to be weird, mate. I mean, I have a past history in debating. That was what got me into.
You're a good debater. You are very good at
But you're getting the sort of mud you'll get thrown at you in politics. I'm not exactly looking forward to it, but it'll be an interesting experience.
I think you've got the substance to back you up, and you're quick and you're witty, and I think you've got.
You're going to give me a fat head.
No, well, it's true though. You could, by an order of magnitude, or maybe a couple in popularity, you very much could be, and I know that from the likes of. That phenomenon of Jordan Peterson. You have something of substance to say, and I've even thought of trying to advocate for you on some of the important media outlets that that I'm aware of, like the Sam Harris show, or the Weinsteins. There's Brett and Heather Hang. They have a podcast called The Dark Horse, and they were on Bill Maher, right? I mean, shit, let's have you on Bill Maher, right? Like,
I'd be happy. The thing is, I find a lot of those people expect sort of identity politics lefties to be the only type of lefties that exist, and that's not me. I mean, I'm no great fan of the identity. In fact, I think identity politics has corrupted the left. So I'm not at all in that mold. So I think I disturb those people a bit. I know I disturbed Peter Schiff. Did you see the discussion I had with Peter Schiff about? I've got to remember the show it was on. Well, that's right, on the Boom Bust Report.
Oh, okay.
Russia Today, Boom Bust Report. I had myself and Peter. Oh, this is terrible. I'm just doing too much on my. I forget myself, Peter Schiff, and Richard Wolff.
Right. Okay.
And,
yeah.
Okay, we were together on the Boom Bust Report. And I know that I throw Peter because he expects standard lefty stuff coming out of me. And he doesn't quite know how to process what I say.
Exactly. No. I think this Dark Horse podcast, they're evolutionary biologists. They are self-identified as liberals, but progressive, and I mean they're good. They're evolutionary biologists, so they really think in a like a scientific way, and it's really cool to see that. But I could jump from that to listening to Vox Day, and why don't we end on that note with a good old plug to Vox, and I hope to see him on. And Steve, until next week.
Thank you. Pop me the reminder email, and I'll give me a day or so, and I'll send it out to each of them.
Okay. All right.
Okay, mate. Bye-bye. Bye.